If you are a child of God, and you believe in His love, His grace, and His power, please subscribe and become part of this growing family of faith. Together, let's spread hope, truth, and the Word of God to the world. May God bless you always. This is the story of Cain and Abel, the first brothers on earth. A story of love, sacrifice, jealousy, and the first murder in human history. And through this story, we begin to see how sin entered the hearts of men, leading toward the path of judgment. From the blood of Abel crying from the ground, to the promise that one day all humanity will stand before God on Judgment Day. Listen closely, and discover one of the most powerful stories ever told. In the beginning, after the garden was lost, the world remained new, vast, and untouched, stretching endlessly beyond the horizon, filled with raw beauty and quiet mystery, as though creation itself was still finding its form, still waiting to be shaped by what would come next. The land was wild, unbroken by cities or kingdoms, covered with fields, rivers, and forests that had never known the weight of human hands, a world both beautiful and uncertain, carrying within it the echo of what had once been perfect. And in that world lived the first family. No longer in the garden. No longer in perfect peace. But still together. Still learning. Still living. Under the open sky, where the sun marked their days and the stars filled their nights, they began to build a life beyond Eden, a life shaped not by perfection, but by effort, by growth, by the choices they would make. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. Genesis 4 verse 1. Their home was simple, their days filled with work, their hearts carrying both the memory of what was lost and the hope of what could still be, as they raised their children in a world that was no longer perfect, yet still full of possibility. And again, she bore his brother Abel. Genesis 4 verse 2. 2 sons. Born into a new world. One family. Standing at the beginning of everything that would follow. And though the world was still quiet, still untouched in many ways, something had already begun. A story of choices, of paths, of what would rise, and what would fall. 2 sons were born into the first family, growing together beneath the same open skies, walking the same fields, hearing the same stories of the garden that had once been home, yet even from the beginning, there was something different within them, something unseen quietly shaping the paths they would one day follow. The first was Cain, strong and determined, a worker of the ground who spent his days turning the soil beneath his hands, learning the rhythm of the earth, planting, building, and shaping life from the land around him. The second was Abel, gentle and watchful, a keeper of sheep who wandered the hills and quiet fields with his flock, living among the stillness of creation, guiding and protecting the animals placed in his care. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. Genesis 4 verse 2. They were brothers. Raised in the same home. Under the same sky. Yet their hearts slowly began to move in different directions, shaped not only by what they did, but by who they were becoming within. Day after day, they worked side by side in the growing world, one tending the earth, the other tending the flock, while their parents watched them with hope, seeing in them the future of humanity, the continuation of the family that had begun after Eden. The field stretched wide before them. The rivers continued to flow. And life moved forward quietly. But beneath that quiet beginning, a deeper story was already unfolding. A story of choices. Of faith. Of the human heart. And though they shared the same blood. As the years passed, the 2 brothers grew into their work, each following a different path, each shaped by the calling that rested upon his life, as the world around them continued to expand beneath the rising and setting of the sun. Cain worked the ground with strength and determination, waking early to till the soil, turning the earth beneath his hands, planting seeds and fighting against the hardness of the land, drawing food from a world that no longer gave easily, but demanded labor, sweat, and persistence. The fields became his focus. the earth his responsibility. And through effort and endurance, he brought forth its fruit. Abel, however, walked a quieter path, spending his days among the flock, guiding sheep across the open hills and still valleys, watching carefully over every movement, every sound, every danger that might rise against them. He learned patience in the silence, gentleness in the stillness, becoming not only a keeper of sheep, but a protector of life placed in his care. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. Genesis 4 verse 2. Though their work was different, both brothers carried purpose, both building their lives beneath the same sky, both growing within the same family, yet their hearts slowly revealed different ways of seeing the world around them. Cain stood close to the soil, shaped by struggle and effort, while Abel walked among living things with quiet care and steady faith, finding peace in the rhythm of the flock and the calmness of the open land. And as time moved forward, their paths became clearer. Two brothers, two callings, living side by side, yet moving toward very different destinies. Days slowly turned into months, and months stretched into years, as the world around the first family continued to grow and change beneath the steady rhythm of the seasons, with each sunrise bringing new labor and each night carrying the quiet lessons of time. The boys who once walked beside their parents as children now stood as men, stronger in body, deeper in thought, shaped by the work of their hands and the paths they had chosen to follow, as responsibility slowly settled upon their lives. Cain's hands grew rough from the soil, marked by years of labor beneath the sun, while Abel's voice became calm and steady among the flock, his patience strengthened through long days spent watching over the sheep in silence and care. The world around them matured with them. Fields expanded, flocks multiplied, and life continued forward. There was no longer the simplicity of childhood, no longer days untouched by duty or expectation, for time had brought with it a deeper awareness of purpose, of responsibility, of the need to choose how they would live before God. Whatever one sows, that will he also reap. Galatians 6 verse 7. The lessons passed down from Adam and Eve remained with them, stories of the garden, of loss, of mercy, and of the God who still watched over creation even after Eden had been left behind. And as the years passed, something began to grow within the hearts of both brothers. A desire to honor God, to bring before Him the work of their lives. For the time was coming when each man would reveal not only the labor of his hands, but the condition of his heart. In the passing of time, as the seasons continued their endless rhythm and the work of each brother filled their days, a moment came when Cain and Abel prepared to bring an offering before God, not out of routine alone, but as an expression of what rested within their hearts. Cain came first, gathering from the fruit of the ground he had worked so hard to cultivate, bringing before the Lord the produce shaped by his labor, the result of long days beneath the sun and years spent fighting against the stubborn earth. Abel also came forward, but from his flock he chose the firstborn, the finest among them, offering not simply what he had, but the best of what had been entrusted to him, bringing it with reverence, faith, and quiet devotion. So Abel brought the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. Genesis 4 verse 4. The moment stood still beneath the open sky, the two brothers side by side before God, each carrying an offering shaped by his own life, his own work, his own heart, while heaven itself seemed to witness what was being placed upon the altar. And then a difference appeared. God looked with favor upon Abel and his offering, receiving it with acceptance, while Cain's offering was not regarded in the same way, not because of the ground he worked, but because something deeper was being revealed beneath the surface. But for Cain and his offering he had no regard. Genesis 4 verse 5. Silence settled heavily between the brothers, as the weight of that moment began to grow within Cain, stirring emotions he could not hide, emotions that slowly darkened his heart. Abel remained quiet, humble before God. But Cain's expression changed. For what began as disappointment was becoming something far more dangerous. Cain stood in silence after the offering, but within him something had begun to change, as disappointment slowly turned into frustration, and frustration into anger, growing quietly beneath the surface like a fire hidden deep within the heart. The fields he once walked with purpose now felt heavy beneath his feet, and the work of his hands no longer brought him peace, for his thoughts remained fixed on the moment before the altar, on the acceptance given to Abel and the rejection he could not understand. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. Genesis 4 verse 5. Abel continued in quiet faithfulness, unaware of how deeply his brother's heart was being consumed, while Cain wrestled inwardly with emotions that grew darker with every passing day, allowing jealousy to take root where humility should have been. Yet even in that moment, God spoke to Cain. Not with destruction. Not with immediate judgment. But with warning. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen?" Genesis 4 verse 6. The voice of God reached directly into Cain's heart, exposing what was happening within him, giving him the opportunity to step back from the path forming before him, to master the anger before it mastered him. If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Genesis 4 verse 7. The warning was clear. Sin waited like a shadow at the entrance of his heart, ready to take hold if he allowed it, ready to turn wounded pride into something destructive, something irreversible. But Cain remained silent. The anger stayed within him, growing, spreading, until what had once been disappointment became resentment toward his own brother. And though the world around them still appeared calm, something dangerous had already begun. The days continued quietly after the warning, the sun still rising over the fields, the wind still moving across the open land, and from the outside, everything seemed unchanged, as though life among the first family carried on as it always had. But within Cain, the struggle had only deepened, as anger continued to grow in silence, hidden beneath his words, hidden behind his actions, slowly hardening his heart while jealousy turned into something darker and far more dangerous. Abel remained unaware of the storm building within his brother, continuing his work among the flock with the same quiet spirit and steady faith that had always marked his life, never imagining that the one who walked beside him carried hatred in his heart. Then one day, Cain spoke to Abel. Not with shouting. Not with visible anger. But calmly. As a brother speaking to his brother. Cain spoke to Abel his brother. Genesis 4 verse 8. He invited him into the field, away from the home, away from the sight of others, into the quiet openness of the land they both knew so well, where only the sky above and the earth beneath would witness what was about to happen. The field stood silent around them. Still. Empty. As the two brothers walked side by side. One carrying peace within his heart. The other carrying darkness. And in that moment, the warning God had given to Cain stood at the edge of fulfillment, as the anger he refused to control now moved toward action. When they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Genesis 4 verse 8. The first act of violence entered the world in silence, beneath the open heavens, brother against brother, as the ground that once received the labor of Cain's hands now received the blood of Abel. And suddenly, everything changed. The field remained still. The wind continued to move. But the innocence of the world was gone. For sin, once crouching at the door, had now entered fully in. The field fell silent after the act was done, the earth unmoving beneath Cain's feet, while Abel lay still upon the ground, his life gone, his voice forever quiet, and yet the silence around them was not empty, for something deeper now filled the land. Cain stood alone beneath the open sky, breathing heavily, staring at what his anger had produced, as the weight of his actions slowly began to settle upon him, not all at once, but like a shadow spreading through his soul. The ground beneath him had changed. The same earth he once cultivated with his hands now carried the blood of his own brother, staining the land with the first murder humanity had ever known. Then the voice of God came again. Not distant. Not hidden, but direct. The Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" Genesis 4 verse 9. The question moved through the silence with terrible weight, not because God lacked knowledge, but because Cain was being confronted with the truth of what he had done, called to face the reality he could no longer escape. But Cain answered with hardness still remaining in his heart, refusing responsibility, hiding behind cold words instead of repentance. "I do not know, am I my brother's keeper?" Genesis 4 verse 9. And then came the response. A response that revealed something greater than silence. "The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." Genesis 4 verse 10. The earth itself had become a witness, the blood of Abel crying out before God, declaring that what had happened in secret beneath the open sky was fully seen by heaven. Cain's sin could not remain hidden. The field could not conceal it. For the Creator who formed mankind from the dust had witnessed the first taking of life. The wind moved quietly across the land once more, but now it carried sorrow, as the first family stood broken by tragedy, and the world, still young and new, now bore the mark of human violence. And Cain, the brother who once worked the ground, now stood before. The voice of God continued in the silence of the field, heavy with truth and justice, as Cain stood trembling beneath the weight of what he had done, unable to escape the reality now resting upon him, for the blood of his brother had cried out from the ground before heaven itself. The earth, which once responded to Cain's labor, had now become a witness against him, forever marked by the violence committed upon it, and the very ground he depended on would no longer receive him in the same way again. "And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." Genesis 4 verse 11. The judgment was not only upon his actions, but upon his future. "When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength." Genesis 4 verse 12. The soil Cain once tilled with confidence would now resist him, the work of his hands becoming harder, emptier, more painful, as though creation itself carried the consequence of what had taken place. And beyond the curse upon the land came another sentence, one that would shape the rest of his life, driving him away from the place he once called home. "You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Genesis 4 verse 12. The word struck deeply within Cain, and for the first time, fear began to rise stronger than anger, as he realized that the life ahead of him would no longer be stable or secure, but marked by wandering, isolation, and the burden of guilt. Cain spoke with desperation, his pride finally broken beneath the weight of judgment, admitting that the punishment felt greater than he could bear, terrified that whoever found him would seek his life in return. "My punishment is greater than I can bear." Genesis 4 verse 13. Yet even in judgment, God showed mercy. The Lord placed a mark upon Cain, not to honor him, but to protect him, preventing others from taking vengeance upon him, showing that even after great sin, the hand of God still restrained complete destruction. The days that followed were filled with sorrow, as silence settled over the first family in a way it never had before, heavy and painful, carrying the absence of Abel in every part of their lives, as though the world itself had changed after the bloodshed in the field. Adam and Eve looked upon the land with grieving hearts, remembering the son they had raised, the gentle shepherd whose life had been taken too soon, while the memory of Cain's actions remained like a shadow over the family that once stood together in peace. The fields Abel once walked now stood empty. The flock moved without his voice. And the pain of loss lingered deeply within them. Sin, which had entered the world in the garden, had now spread further, bringing death not only to the earth, but into the heart of the family itself, revealing how quickly jealousy and anger could destroy what once was whole. "For the wages of sin is death." Romans 6 verse 23. Cain had gone into exile, wandering far from his home, carrying the mark placed upon him, while Adam and Eve remained behind, learning to live with grief, regret, and the painful understanding of what humanity had become outside Eden. Yet even in the midst of sorrow, life continued. The sun still rose each morning. The rivers still flowed. And time continued moving forward beneath the hand of God. In the passing of years, hope slowly began to appear again, not erasing the pain of Abel's loss, but reminding the family that their story was not completely finished, that even after tragedy, God had not abandoned them. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel. Genesis 4 verse 25. A new son was born. Not to replace Abel, but to continue the line that violence had tried to destroy. And through Seth, a new chapter quietly began. For even after sorrow, even after judgment, the story of humanity continued, under the watchful eyes of God. As the years continued to pass across the growing earth, the family of Adam began to expand once again, and through Seth, a new generation slowly emerged, carrying with it a different spirit, a quieter path shaped not by violence or rebellion, but by a desire to seek after God. The pain of the past was not forgotten, for the memory of Abel still lingered within the hearts of his family, and the story of Cain remained a warning carried from one generation to the next, reminding them how quickly sin could take hold when the heart turned away from what was right. Yet through Seth, hope remained alive. His life became the beginning of a new line, one that would continue through generations, preserving the knowledge of God in a world that was slowly becoming darker and more corrupted with time. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. Genesis 4 verse 26. Families grew. Children were born. And humanity spread across the earth beneath the same skies that had watched over the first family from the beginning. But among the descendants of Seth, something important began to rise once more, something that had nearly disappeared beneath the weight of sin and sorrow. At that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Genesis 4 verse 26. Voices lifted again in worship, in prayer, in remembrance of God. Though the world was no longer Eden, though pain and death had entered creation, there were still those who desired to walk in faith, to live differently, to seek the Creator even in a broken world. The generations continued forward, year after year, as cities began to rise, as people multiplied across the land. And beneath it all, two paths slowly formed among humanity. One moving toward God, the other moving away from Him. And as time passed, the difference between those paths would grow greater and greater, changing the future of the world itself. As generations multiplied across the earth, humanity began to spread further than ever before, moving into new lands, building homes, shaping settlements, and slowly forming the early foundations of societies, as the world that once felt empty and untouched began to fill with the footprints of mankind. The descendants of Cain built cities, learning to craft tools, work with metals, and establish systems of living, as human skill and knowledge increased with each passing generation, bringing progress and innovation, but also carrying within it the same fallen nature that had marked the beginning. And Cain built a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Genesis 4 verse 17. Life became more structured, more advanced, yet also more distant from the simplicity of earlier days, as people began to rely more on their own strength, their own abilities, and less on the remembrance of God who had created them. At the same time, the line of Seth continued quietly, preserving faith in the midst of a growing and changing world, as those who called upon the name of the Lord remained a contrast to the expanding cities around them. Two paths were now clearly forming. One built on human achievement, the other grounded in faith and dependence on God. And between these paths, the tension of humanity's future quietly grew. The earth itself was no longer new, no longer untouched, but shaped by both righteousness and rebellion, by worship and by forgetfulness, as time moved steadily forward without pause. Then people began to multiply on the face of the land. Genesis 6 verse 1. And as humanity increased, so did its choices. Each generation standing at a crossroads, deciding whether to walk in remembrance of the Creator, or to pursue their own ways in the growing world. And slowly, The difference between those paths began to define the direction of all creation. As the earth continued to fill with people and cities grew larger beneath the expanding sky, something unseen but powerful also began to spread among humanity, moving quietly through hearts, shaping thoughts, and influencing choices, as the distance between people and their Creator slowly grew wider with each passing generation. What once began as simple independence slowly turned into deeper rebellion, as people began to rely fully on their own strength, their own desires, and their own understanding, forgetting the foundation upon which life had first been established. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Genesis 6 verse 5. The world, once filled with potential and purpose, now carried a growing weight of corruption. As violence increased, truth became rare, and the boundaries of morality began to fade in the eyes of many who no longer walked in remembrance of God. Even the earth itself seemed affected by what was happening, as if creation groaned under the choices of humanity, witnessing the rise of chaos where order once existed, and sorrow where peace had once been known. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. Genesis 6 verse 11. Yet in the midst of this growing darkness, there remained a small contrast, a quiet remnant of those who still sought to walk with God, who still remembered His name, and who lived differently from the surrounding world. But they were becoming fewer. And the difference between the two paths was becoming more visible with every generation. One path embraced self-reliance, pride, and rebellion. The other remained rooted in faith, obedience, and remembrance of the Creator. And as time moved forward, the tension between these ways of life continued to grow, until it reached a point where something in the world could no longer remain unchanged. For corruption was no longer isolated. As corruption spread across the earth and violence filled the land, something deeper than human history began to unfold, something unseen yet profoundly real, as the condition of humanity reached a point that reflected not only brokenness in the world, but sorrow in the heart of its Creator. The choices of mankind had multiplied beyond measure, and what once began as small steps away from truth had now become a world moving steadily in its own direction, where the knowledge of God was no longer central in the hearts of many, and righteousness was no longer the guiding force of life. And the Lord regretted that He had made man on the earth, and it grieved Him to His heart. Genesis 6 verse 6. This was not a moment of confusion, but of deep sorrow, as the reality of human rebellion filled the earth, and the consequences of free will, misused and corrupted, became fully visible across generations, shaping a world that no longer reflected its original design. The land itself bore witness to the brokenness, as violence increased and the value of life diminished in the eyes of many, while the distance between humanity and its Creator continued to grow wider, generation after generation. The earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. Genesis 6 verse 11. Yet even in this sorrow, there remained a quiet truth that could not be erased, that God had not abandoned His creation, and that within the darkness, there were still moments, still lives, still hearts that remembered Him, even if they were few. The contrast between light and darkness had become unmistakable, as two realities now coexisted on the same earth, one moving toward restoration, the other descending further into corruption. And as the world continued forward in this condition, a decision began to form in the heavens, not born from impulse, but from justice, from holiness, and from the necessity of addressing what had become of the earth. For sorrow had filled the heart of God. In the midst of a world filled with corruption, violence, and growing darkness, there remained a quiet contrast, a single life that stood apart from the patterns of the generation around him, not because he was untouched by the world, but because his heart was anchored in something higher, something unchanging. As others drifted further into rebellion and self-will, one man continued to walk differently, choosing obedience over compromise, faith over confusion, and reverence over the growing disregard for God that filled the earth. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Genesis 6 verse 8. He was not a man of fame or power in the eyes of the world, but in the eyes of God, his life carried something rare, a posture of faithfulness in a generation that had largely forgotten its Creator, making him a living contrast to the darkness around him. Noah walked with steady devotion, not because the world around him encouraged it, but because his understanding of God shaped the way he lived, the way he worked, and the way he raised his family in the midst of a broken generation. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Genesis 6 verse 9. While corruption spread across cities and violence filled the earth, Noah remained grounded in faith, standing as a quiet witness that righteousness was still possible, even when surrounded by overwhelming opposition. And in that time, God chose to reveal something to Noah that no one else could see, a plan that would unfold not only as judgment upon the world, but also as preservation through obedience, marking a turning point in the story of humanity. For even in a world heading toward destruction, one man's faith would change everything. As Noah walked faithfully in a world that had grown dark with corruption and violence, a moment came that would change the course of everything, not through human discovery or worldly change, but through a direct word from God, breaking into the silence of his life with clarity and purpose. The earth around him continued as it had been, filled with people living according to their own desires, unaware of the judgment that was forming beyond what they could see, while Noah stood apart, carrying a message that no one else yet understood. And then God spoke. Not in confusion. Not in uncertainty. But in certainty and authority. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Genesis 6 verse 13. The words carried weight beyond human understanding, revealing that what had grown across the earth was no longer sustainable, as corruption had reached its fullness, and a decisive act was now set in motion. Yet even in judgment, there was instruction, a path of preservation given to one man, a way through obedience where life could be sustained through what was about to come. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Genesis 6 verse 14. Noah listened in silence, receiving instructions that would require years of faithfulness, effort, and perseverance, building something that had never been seen before in a world that had never experienced what was coming. The ark was not just a structure. It was a response to a warning. A shelter in the midst of coming judgment. A sign that God had not forgotten his creation, even as he prepared to act upon its corruption. And behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh. Genesis 6 verse 17. The message was clear. What the world had built in rebellion would not stand forever, but through obedience, a remnant would be preserved, carried through what others could not survive. And so Noah began. Not in fear. Not in confusion. But in obedience. Under a sky that still looked unchanged, Noah began to obey the word he had received, even though nothing around him yet showed signs of what was coming, as the world continued in its usual rhythm, unaware that something unlike anything ever seen was being prepared in silence. Day after day, he worked with steady hands and unwavering faith, cutting wood, shaping beams, and assembling a structure far larger than anything the earth had known, while those around him watched with confusion, unable to understand why one man would dedicate so many years to something that seemed impossible. The ark slowly took shape. Massive. Unusual. And unlike anything built before. Yet Noah did not stop, for his obedience was not based on what others understood, but on what God had spoken, even when the world around him could not see the reason behind it. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, and this is how you are to make it. Genesis 6 verses 14 to 15. As the structure grew larger, so did the ridicule of those who passed by, for to them it seemed unnecessary, a strange work in a world where life continued as it always had, without any visible change in the sky or the ground beneath them. Yet Noah continued, year after year, building in faith what had been revealed in warning, carrying not only wood and tools, but also the weight of a message that the world refused to hear. And while the ark rose higher, something else remained unchanged. The condition of the earth. Corruption still filled the land. Violence still continued. And hearts remained distant from God. Until the day came when the building was complete, and the time of preparation slowly shifted toward something far more serious, as the final instructions were given regarding what would enter the ark and what would be preserved through what was about to come. For the ark was no longer just a structure being built. It was now a place of refuge, standing ready in a world that did not yet realize its need for it. As the ark stood complete, towering above the land like a silent witness to years of obedience, a strange calm settled over the world, not a peace born of righteousness, but a stillness that seemed to signal a turning point, as though creation itself was unknowingly preparing for what had already been spoken. Then came a moment unlike any before, as animals began to move in ways that could not be explained by human understanding, gathering from the fields, the forests, and the wilderness, not scattered or confused, but drawn together with purpose toward the place God had appointed. Pairs began to arrive. One by one. Species by species. Moving toward the ark in obedience that reflected something deeper than instinct, as though creation itself was responding to the command of its maker, while those who watched could only stand in silence, witnessing something beyond human control. You shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you. Genesis 6 verse 19. Inside the ark, Noah worked in preparation, receiving and guiding what had been sent, ensuring that everything was arranged according to the instructions given, while his family remained close, witnessing the unfolding of events that confirmed every word he had spoken for years. The animals came without force, without fear, as though led by an unseen hand, entering the ark in perfect order, male and female, each according to its kind, filling the space that had been prepared for preservation in the midst of what was about to come. And still, outside, the world continued as before, many unaware, many unconcerned, as life carried on in its usual pattern, even while something unprecedented was quietly taking place before their eyes. For the separation had now begun, between what would be preserved and what would remain outside. And once the final entrance was made, the time of waiting would come to an end. As the last of the living creatures entered the ark, and Noah and his family stood inside what had been prepared over many years of obedience, a final stillness fell over the moment, as though creation itself paused to acknowledge that the time of preparation had reached its end. Inside the ark, there was no confusion, only quiet completion, as every instruction had been fulfilled, every detail arranged, and every living thing that was meant to be preserved had found its place within the shelter God had provided. And then, something changed. Not with noise, not with force, but with finality. The Lord shut him in. Genesis 7 verse 16. The door of the ark was closed, not by human hands, but by the hand of God himself, marking the separation between what was inside and what remained outside, between mercy prepared and judgment about to unfold. Outside, the world continued in its usual pattern, unaware that the moment of grace had ended, as people carried on with their lives, unaware that the opportunity for refuge had passed, and that what was coming would no longer be delayed. Inside the ark, silence remained. Not fear, not panic, but anticipation, as Noah and his family waited within the space of obedience, knowing that everything God had spoken was about to begin, even though they could not yet see how it would unfold. And outside, the sky began to change. Subtle at first, then undeniable. As the atmosphere itself seemed to shift, signaling the beginning of what had been warned for generations, while the earth, still unchanged on the surface, stood at the edge of transformation. For the door was no longer open. The separation had been made. And the time of the flood was about to begin. The sky above the earth, once familiar and steady in its rhythm, began to shift in a way that no generation had ever witnessed before, as clouds gathered with an unnatural heaviness, covering the horizon and stretching across the world like a vast curtain drawing slowly closed over creation. At first, there was only stillness. A silence that felt deeper than normal, as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something unseen to break through the calm that remained. Then it came. A single drop. falling from the sky for the first time in human history, striking the ground with quiet certainty, marking the beginning of something the world had never experienced, something that had only been spoken of, but never seen. For after 7 days I will send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Genesis 7 verse 4. And then the second drop. And the third. Until slowly, steadily, the rain began to increase, turning from scattered drops into a steady pouring, as the heavens released what had been held back for generations, fulfilling every word that had been spoken. Outside the ark, confusion spread quickly, as people looked up at the sky in disbelief, unable to understand what they were seeing, for rain had never fallen upon the earth before, and now it came without stopping, without warning, without delay. Inside the ark, Noah remained still. Not in fear. Not in panic. But in understanding, as the reality of God's word unfolded exactly as it had been declared, confirming that everything spoken was true, even when it had seemed impossible to others. The rain grew stronger. The ground began to change. As water slowly began to rise from below and pour from above, joining together in a way that would reshape the entire surface of the earth, while those outside still struggled to comprehend what was happening around them. And the separation between inside and outside, between safety and judgment, became clearer with every passing moment. The rain that had begun as a single drop had now grown into a relentless downpour, filling the skies with a continuous sound that covered the earth like a vast curtain, as if the heavens themselves had opened fully and would not close again. Hour after hour. Day after day. The waters increased without pause, falling upon the ground with a force that reshaped the land, as rivers overflowed, valleys filled, and the dry earth that once stood firm began to disappear beneath the rising flood. On that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Genesis 7 verse 11. The waters did not come from only one direction, but from both above and below, as though creation itself was releasing what had been stored within it, allowing the fullness of what had been spoken to unfold across the entire earth. Outside the ark, panic replaced confusion, as people realized too late that the rain would not stop, that the waters were not receding, and that the ground beneath their feet was no longer stable or safe. But there was no escape. The waters continued to rise. Covering fields. Covering homes. Covering everything that once stood firm. Until even the highest places of the earth began to be swallowed by what had come. Inside the ark, Noah and his family remained steady, carried not by sight, but by trust, as the structure that had been built in obedience now floated upon the very waters that had overtaken the world around them. And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. Genesis 7 verse 19. What once seemed impossible had now become reality, as the separation between judgment and preservation became complete, visible, and undeniable. The ark moved gently upon the rising waters. Not shaken. Not destroyed. But sustained. And as the world outside disappeared beneath the flood, the reality of what had been spoken became clear to all creation. What God had declared. The waters continued to rise until the entire surface of the earth was covered, until the familiar shapes of land, valleys, and cities were no longer visible, as everything that once stood beneath the sky was now hidden beneath a vast and endless flood. What had been built over generations, what had been known as home, was now gone from sight. And every living thing that moved on the earth perished, everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. Genesis 7 verses 21 to 22. The world that once carried the noise of human life had fallen into a deep and overwhelming silence, broken only by the movement of the waters and the presence of what remained afloat upon them. Above the flood, only one structure remained steady. The ark. Not drifting without purpose, not lost in chaos, but carried upon the surface of the waters with stability that did not come from human strength, but from the hand that had shut its door. And the waters prevailed on the earth for 150 days. Genesis 7 verse 24. Inside, Noah and his family were preserved, not because they were untouched by the world around them, but because they had responded in obedience when the warning was given, holding on to faith while everything else around them was being removed. Outside, there was no movement of cities, no sound of daily life, no sign of what once was, as the flood covered all things, leaving behind only water where land once stood. Yet even in judgment, there was preservation. A reminder that what God had spoken was not empty, and that even when the earth was overwhelmed, His promise remained steady upon the waters. And so the ark continued to float, carrying within it the future of humanity, as the old world was no more. After many days of overwhelming waters covering the earth, a quiet shift began to take place, not sudden or dramatic, but gradual and almost unnoticed at first, as though creation itself was slowly moving toward a new turning point. The rain that had once fallen without pause began to lessen, then stop completely, leaving behind a heavy silence across the endless waters that still covered everything the eye could see. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. Genesis 8 verse 1. A wind moved across the surface of the flood, not violent, but steady and purposeful, as if guiding the waters toward their appointed place, preparing the world for what would come next after judgment had been completed. The waters began to slowly retreat. Not all at once, but step by step. As the surface of the earth, once completely hidden, began to shift beneath the movement of time and divine order, revealing that the flood was not without end, but part of a greater process of restoration. The ark remained steady upon the waters, no longer moving through rising chaos, but resting upon a vast stillness, as the world around it began to change once more. Inside the ark, Noah waited patiently, not rushing, not forcing anything, but trusting the timing of God, knowing that what had been spoken would also be completed in its time. And the waters receded from the earth continually. Genesis 8 verse 3. Day by day, the waters decreased, revealing the tops of mountains, then higher ground, as the earth slowly re-emerged from beneath the flood that had once covered everything. What had been lost beneath judgment was now being revealed again, not in its former state, but in a world that had been reshaped by what had taken place. And as the waters continued to withdraw, a new beginning slowly approached. For the earth was no longer as it was before. And what would come next would mark the start of something entirely new. As the waters continued to recede across the face of the earth, a slow but steady transformation began to unfold, as what was once a completely submerged world started to reveal fragments of what lay beneath, hinting that the judgment of the flood was drawing toward its conclusion. The ark remained still upon the surface, carried not by chaos anymore, but by a calm that signaled change, as Noah and his family waited with patience, watching and trusting the process that only God could complete in His time. Then, after many days of waiting, a sign appeared. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. Genesis 8 verse 5. Distant shapes began to rise above the waterline, faint at first, then clearer, as the highest points of the earth slowly broke through the surface, revealing that the flood was no longer fully covering the world. The mountains stood once again, silent, worn, but present. A reminder that beneath the waters, the earth still remained, waiting for restoration after the judgment that had passed over it. Inside the ark, hope began to rise quietly, not as excitement or haste, but as a deep awareness that the time of waiting was moving toward its fulfillment, and that what had been hidden for so long was slowly returning into view. Noah observed carefully, not rushing ahead, but remaining obedient to the timing of God, understanding that even though the land was now visible, the moment of stepping out had not yet come. For in yet 7 days I will send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Genesis 7 verse 4. The world outside was no longer the same. What had been destroyed had been removed. What remained was being revealed. And as the mountains rose once more above the waters, a new chapter of the earth quietly began to take shape beneath the fading flood. Even after the first peaks of the mountains had appeared above the waters, the earth was still far from ready, as vast stretches of land remained hidden beneath the flood, and the world stood in a quiet transition between what had been destroyed and what was about to be restored. Inside the ark, time moved slowly, measured not by the chaos of the outside world, but by patience and obedience, as Noah and his family waited without knowing the exact moment when they would step into a renewed earth. The waters continued to decrease gradually. Day after day. Week after week. Revealing more of the landscape that had once been familiar, but now looked different, reshaped by judgment and time, as if the earth itself had been given a new beginning beneath the hand of God. And at the end of 40 days Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made. Genesis 8 verse 6. From within the ark, Noah began to observe carefully, seeking signs that the land was becoming habitable again, sending out a raven to see if the waters had receded enough for life outside to continue. The raven flew back and forth, searching, circling, but finding no place to rest, as the waters still covered much of the earth, leaving only fragments of dry ground visible in distant places. Later, Noah sent out a dove, a symbol of hope, to see if the waters had decreased further, but the dove found no resting place and returned, reminding Noah that the earth was still in the process of renewal. So he waited another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. Genesis 8 verse 10. This time, the waiting continued with expectation, as Noah trusted that in due time, the earth would fully emerge, and the moment of new life outside the ark would arrive. Inside, silence remained. Not empty silence, but patient silence. As the world outside slowly changed, and hope began to take shape with every passing day. For though judgment had passed, restoration was now in motion. And the earth was. After days of patient waiting inside the ark, Noah once again prepared to send out the dove, watching carefully as the world outside continued its slow transformation from judgment toward renewal, with more dry ground now visible across the distant horizon. The floodwaters had receded significantly, revealing valleys, hills, and wide stretches of land that had once been completely submerged, signaling that the earth was steadily becoming habitable once again, though not yet fully restored. So he waited another 7 days and sent forth the dove again. Genesis 8 verse 10. The dove was released into a world still in transition, flying across the newly revealed landscape, searching for a place to rest, a sign that life could begin again beyond the ark that had preserved it through the waters. For a time, it found nothing. Only water in certain places. Only barren ground still drying beneath the sun. But this time, something had changed. The dove returned, but not empty. It carried something small. A freshly plucked olive leaf. And behold, in her mouth was a freshly plucked olive leaf. Genesis 8 verse 11. A sign of life. A sign of renewal. A sign that the earth was healing. Inside the ark, hope became clearer than ever before, as Noah saw that the world outside was no longer under judgment, but entering a new phase of restoration, where vegetation was beginning to grow again and life was returning to the land. The olive leaf was not just a piece of nature. It was a message. That the waters were receding. That the earth was recovering. That the waiting was nearing its end. Noah waited yet again, continuing in obedience, not rushing the process, but trusting the timing of God, knowing that every step had meaning, and every delay had purpose. And as the dove did not return again, the silence inside the ark began to shift. From waiting to preparation. As time continued to pass, the earth beneath the floodwaters began to fully emerge, revealing landscapes that had been hidden for months, as valleys, plains, and mountains slowly dried under the returning warmth of the sun, signaling that the cleansing waters were nearing their complete withdrawal. Inside the ark, Noah and his family waited with quiet patience, no longer in uncertainty, but in steady expectation, as the signs outside confirmed what God had already begun. Restoration was taking place across the earth. And in the 601st year, the waters were dried from off the earth. Genesis 8 verse 13. The once endless flood was now gone, replaced by ground that was slowly becoming firm again, as the earth, though changed, was no longer submerged beneath judgment, but standing under a new beginning shaped by what had passed. Noah looked out carefully, observing the land, seeing that the surface was no longer covered, but still not yet fully ready for life to step out freely, as the ground needed time to settle and strengthen after the long covering of water. The ark itself had rested for many days upon the mountains of Ararat, becoming a place of preservation through the entire flood, and now a place of waiting before the new world could be entered. And the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat. Genesis 8 verse 4. The silence inside the ark was no longer heavy, but peaceful, as hope replaced waiting, and anticipation grew stronger with each passing day, knowing that soon the door would open to a renewed earth. Outside, life was beginning again in small ways, as plants slowly returned and the ground dried under the sun, preparing to support what would once again walk upon it. And Noah, still faithful, waited for the final instruction. For the moment when God would declare that the time of leaving had come. As the earth continued to dry and the waters fully withdrew from the surface, a quiet stillness settled over creation, not the silence of judgment anymore, but the calm that follows transformation, as if the world itself was taking its first breath after being renewed. Inside the ark, Noah did not move hastily, even though the signs outside were clear, for he understood that seeing the land was not the same as being called to step onto it, and that every moment still depended on the timing of God. The mountains stood firm once again. The valleys stretched wide and open. And the earth, though changed, was readying itself for life to return. And in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth had dried out. Genesis 8 verse 14. At last, the drying was complete, and what had once been a world covered in water was now fully revealed beneath the sky, waiting in silence for its first inhabitants to step forward into a renewed beginning. Inside the ark, anticipation grew, but still Noah waited, not driven by emotion, but by obedience, knowing that even a finished earth required a spoken word from God before anything could begin again. The animals remained calm within the ark. The family remained together. And everything held in quiet readiness. Then, at the right moment, the voice that had guided Noah from the beginning spoke once more, not in warning this time, but in release, marking the transition from preservation to restoration. And with that command, the waiting would end. And the new world would begin. After many months of waiting, watching, and trusting, the moment finally came when the silence inside the ark was broken by a command that carried both relief and completion, as what had been preserved through judgment was now being released into restoration. Noah stood quietly, his heart steady, knowing that this was not a decision made by sight, but by obedience, as the same voice that had shut the door at the beginning was now preparing to open the way forward. Then God said to Noah, "Go out from the ark, you and your wife, and your sons' wives with you." Genesis 8 verse 16. The door that had once been sealed shut was now opened, not by confusion or uncertainty, but by divine instruction, marking the transition from waiting inside preservation to stepping into a renewed earth. One by one, the living creatures began to move out, filling the land once again with life, as birds took to the skies, animals spread across the ground, and the earth slowly began to feel alive in a way it had not for a long time. Noah and his family followed, stepping carefully onto the dry ground, feeling the firmness of the earth beneath their feet, a world that had been washed clean, yet still carried the memory of what had passed through it. The air was different. The land was quiet. But it was new. Not untouched like Eden, but renewed after judgment. And as Noah looked across the vast landscape, he understood that this was not the end of the story, but the beginning of something entirely new, a world starting again under the mercy and sovereignty of God. For what had been saved through the ark was now stepping into its purpose. As Noah stepped fully onto the dry earth, the silence of the old world felt distant, almost like a fading memory carried far behind them, while before them stretched a land that had been washed clean, waiting to be filled once again with life, purpose, and new beginnings. The sun rose gently over the horizon, casting light across mountains and valleys that had been hidden for so long, as if creation itself was being revealed again for the first time, not as it was before, but as it had been renewed through judgment and mercy. And Noah built an altar to the Lord. Genesis 8 verse 20. The first act on the new earth was not building a city, not reclaiming possession, but worship, as Noah responded to deliverance with gratitude, acknowledging the one who had preserved life through the flood and brought them safely into a renewed world. The altar stood as a simple but powerful symbol, made from what was available, yet carrying deep meaning, as Noah offered sacrifices in reverence, remembering both judgment and mercy, destruction and salvation. The fragrance of worship rose into the open sky, marking the beginning of a new relationship between humanity and a cleansed earth, where life would continue under a renewed covenant of grace. And God responded. Not with judgment, but with promise. I will never again curse the ground because of man. Genesis 8 verse 21. A covenant began to take shape over the earth, not because humanity had become perfect, but because mercy had been established as part of God's plan for the future of creation. The rhythm of the seasons would continue. Seed time and harvest. Cold and heat. All would remain steady as long as the earth endured. And as Noah stood before the altar, looking across the renewed world, he understood that this was not just survival. It was a beginning shaped by grace. A new chapter for all humanity.